Welcome to Mazungumzo, African Scholarly Conversations, a podcast that highlights the perspectives of various stakeholders in academia and research fields across Africa through open dialogue or Mazungumzo on scholarly communication in Africa.
Welcome to Mazungumzo, African Scholarly Conversations, where we are joined by an expansive list of African policymakers, science communication specialists, innovators, and tertiary institutional leads who contribute to this realm of science and scholarly communication. I'm your host, Joy Owango, the Executive Director of Training Center in Communication, Capacity Building Trust based at the University of Nairobi, Kenya. Our guest today is a professor and dean of the School of Public Health at Makerere University, Uganda, position she has held for the past 6.5 years. She has extensive experience in research, capacity building, program management, and policy development in various public health areas. She also has vast governance experience and has served on several boards for organizations in Uganda and globally. In addition to this, Professor Rhoda Wanyenze is an executive board member of the Declaration on Research Assessment, popularly known as DORA. In this episode, Professor Wanyenze shares her perspective on an important issue, which is refocusing on how we assess and incentivize research to prioritize societal impact. A warm welcome, Daktari.
Joy, I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you, and greetings to our listeners.
Okay. Before we dive into the main topic, please tell our listeners about your background and what has inspired your career path in public health research.
So, who is Rhoda and what have I been up to? I have been in the health field for the last 30 years. Since I completed my training as a medical doctor, and then moved on to public health work, especially with programs and policy, working with programs, supporting strengthening of systems for the Ministry of Health alongside other stakeholders. So it was a career that started with clinical work, then moving into programs and policy. And then finally, I ended up in research and academia, where I have been for the last more than 20 years, doing research initially with the research institutions, and then eventually moving into Makerere University as a professor. So it's been quite some time. And my inspiration in this journey, I would say, I love research. I really love research. I have this curious mind where I'm always looking out for something that needs to be done differently. So since I interfaced with research in research teams about 24 years ago, I have not looked back. I have continued to do research even before I joined the academic space. I have been doing this. And then my shift from policies and research institutions into academia was largely driven by my desire to contribute to training of the next generation health professionals, public health leaders, as well as researchers. In engaging with a number of students coming out of universities, I felt perhaps there are certain things we need to strengthen in terms of how they are better prepared to align with the field out there. And I just felt, rather than stay out there and complain about some of the issues, like, for example, the leadership skills, being able to engage with multiple stakeholders and communities to be able to deliver services, I thought, why not step in there and be part of preparing them? So that was really my biggest inspiration. And then I have since worked with a lot of research groups, partnerships with universities in Uganda and other institutions, and partnerships with the universities in the North, especially in the USA and Europe. And then I've also had quite a number of partnerships with African institutions where I have been a lead for a number of networks Some of the most recent networks I've worked in Africa include what we call the Partnership to Enhance Analytical Capacity and Data Use in Africa. That network, we closed off the work that we were doing in December of last year, although we are hoping to continue this work hopefully sometime this year. And we were a partnership of 12 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, working with ministries of health to enhance use of data in HIV, TB, and malaria. Then I've also had a network that I led to assess the response to COVID-19 across 5 countries in Eastern and Western Africa, among others, across infectious diseases, sexual and reproductive health, as well as health systems. Yeah, so it's been a rich and rewarding career of working with so many people in Uganda and so many people across the African continent.
Fantastic. And from your experience across Africa in academia and research implementation, and also now policy, what are the major limitations in how research outputs and real-world impacts are typically measured and incentivized within current academic assessment model?
So before I get to the measures and how this is done, I would like to speak briefly around the issues surrounding alignment of research with the real world needs and making sure that we are able to translate these findings and create impact within the communities. It may seem obvious that translation is something that everybody will do, and we'll focus on, because every researcher that you engage with is talking about translation. It's a buzzword. We also engage at institutional level, and everybody is talking about translation. And so you assume it's something that we will do. It's easy to do, and you'll just do it. And then when you ask what is translation, everybody's just talking about, I disseminated my work and it was attended, this dissemination was attended by so many people. And then when you ask, so what happened after that? There's no follow-up. And the engagement is often happening at the tail end when the evidence is available already. And its alignment is sometimes questionable. So this is an area that perhaps needs to be given a lot more thought in terms of how it's structured with and integrated within the research ecosystem in academic institutions, let alone the issue around how it's measured. And there are quite a number of issues around here as well, because there's so much evidence. So in Africa, we have so little evidence, and especially in some spaces, but there's also so much evidence in some areas. And sometimes the evidence conflicts, and sometimes there are, tons and tons of that and a lot of things to read. So it needs a lot of time, it needs a lot of space to analyze before a policymaker, for example, or someone in a program can decide that this is worth applying and this is how it's going to be applied. So there's quite a lot that we need to think through in this space. And then sometimes we do research that's not even aligned to what the policymakers need. It's not as responsive, or maybe in terms of the timing, it's not coming out quickly enough. And sometimes you're doing a study that's going to rightfully take a very long time before the evidence comes out. But the policymaker wants the answer today. So there are quite a number of issues there that we need to think through. But then there's also an emerging area of people trusting the evidence. I'm sure you've seen quite a number of, especially on social media, people countering even well-established evidence. People are talking about vaccinations and how this is intended to hurt Africans and a number of things. So there's a growing distrust in evidence. And because of this, we don't want to take it for granted that as long as we generate it, people will use it. We have to do it in a manner that engages right from the start.
Absolutely.
People want to hear what they're anxious about, understand, the questions they have. Sometimes you're going to test an intervention, but they'll tell you this intervention doesn't work for us. I've had an experience where we were going to test an intervention. It was so intensive. And when we engaged with the users, they said, even if you show that it works, we will never implement it. It will be too expensive. And so they gave us what they thought might be manageable. Can you adjust some of these pieces? And we actually were able to do that. And then they said, could you also track the costs so that when you're done, and if it works, we know how much it will has to do with. So those are the kinds of engagement you need to do before you even crystallize the questions you're going to answer, the methodologies you're going to use. But you also get people to have confidence in you, and when they know that you value them, you have integrated their thoughts, they identify with what you're doing, they own it, and it makes the process much easier, but not just coming in tail end to do the translation. But at the same time, we have to recognize that this is an expensive process in terms of time, and sometimes it costs money. So these are some of the areas where you feel scientists need to think intentionally and budget for them, and even engage with the funders so that they know that certain things might not move too fast because we have to engage the users before we move another step. But that said, there are quite a number of issues around measurements in terms of what do we measure, what are the incentives anyway, because there is measurement. But how do I benefit? Because we've all heard you publish or you perish, and publish or you perish because everybody values a publication, and so everybody, really driven to publish and as many articles as possible, and sometimes even fragmenting what could have been one paper into two, because you need papers to be able to survive. So this measurement that focuses largely on the number of publications, and then sometimes for some institutions, it's not even just the numbers, it's which journal did you publish in. And if it's which journal did you publish in, then it's the journal impact factor that is really, really, drummed up, and sometimes someone gets their paper rejected so many times simply because they want to start with the highest impact factor, and then they come down. And sometimes I've engaged with colleagues and said, your work is so important and people need to hear it at this point. Get it to the journal that's going to review it fastest and get it out so that people can engage with it. And then you hear it's about journal impact factor. And then you're saying, no, a journal that targets the audience that needs to hear about your paper is the journal you want to go for. Is it a journal that will be accessible to clinicians if you've done clinical work? Is it a journal that's going to go into issues around policy and analysis of this issue? But often people don't think about that. They're just thinking, what's the impact factor? And it doesn't matter how long it takes for that paper to come out. And then we have, moving away from that, people, again, beginning to say citations, because this is more objective. It's going to tell us how scientists are engaging with your work. And so people want to see citations. This is a big one. So you have institutions that have now moved ahead to integrate various citation metrics like the H index. And so you have your CV, not just the numbers of publications. They're not just going to look at the journal, but they're also going to look at the citation indices that they've now integrated. So this can be a challenge, and often it's done without necessarily looking at discipline-specific differences. In certain disciplines, people have a lot of journals that churn out a lot of papers in certain spaces. So there are many more people citing your work. In some other disciplines, you have less of that happening. So you're going to get somebody maybe in the clinical sciences where we often tend to have a lot more papers and citations, and you're comparing them with someone in philosophy.
Or even engineering.
And so sometimes we don't even look at those discipline-specific differences, and neither do we sometimes look beyond a journal impact factor and say, so fine, this is a high-impact journal, but you could write there a paper that is cited just 5 times when somebody could have a lower impact factor journal, but their work is perhaps, very well received, and you have so many people engaging with it and citing more. But at the same time, we know that people don't always cite your paper because it's good. Sometimes they cite it because they are criticizing it. because maybe there's something they don't agree with. So what necessarily do these numbers mean that we are increasingly?
Yeah.
And
Because they're
at
not
the same
entirely objective at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So quite often many people gravitate to these numbers because they say they are objective, but actually they might not be as objective depending on how you're used.
Right.
So yeah, that can be quite challenging, and I think we need to rethink some of these things as we quickly adopt without necessarily.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is that there's a need for cultural evolution in academia. We need a paradigm shift. Yeah. And if that is the case, how can the research ecosystem better incentivize impactful knowledge translation alongside publishing requirements?
I think we actually need that shift, and we needed it like yesterday. And we need to start thinking about the things that are really most valuable and meaningful about research.
Right.
Thinking about the impact, thinking about what actions are taken out there is so important, but we are not tracking this in the first place. Most academic institutions and research institutions don't intentionally think through this. They don't have the tools and have not yet moved towards tracking some of these processes. Engaging stakeholders, for example, the example I gave you around just getting to hear what the user would like to know and what would work for them before you implement it. They're not tracking those kinds of processes. They don't really matter at the moment. And so because we don't track, we also don't consider that if we are promoting you, I did my work and it has led to a shift in policy, and that policy might have really helped improve service delivery or the lives of people, but that is not tracked. That is not considered if I'm going to be promoted. So we need to shift and begin to track those kinds of things. We also need to be thinking about the quality of the work that we do, because it's about the quality of the work and how well conceptualized it is, how responsive it is, and then engaging the stakeholders and being able to ensure that the findings can shift the space in thinking and action. So this needs to be done. But at the same time, we need to take it beyond just tracking translation to also think about the processes, the partnerships, the collaborative work that we need to do across disciplines, across institutions that enhance the quality and the robustness of the work that we do and the level of innovation. So all these things are very critical, but they are not tracked. And they are quite often in the pathway towards translation. So we need to be thinking through tracking the processes, but also tracking the outcomes, and then moving into the actions that have been taken in terms of eventually how the tools that we develop or the evidence that we generate has been used to impact people out there. So we need to be thinking through this a bit more critically and evolving new mechanisms of tracking and hopefully going beyond just numbers, because even as we think about new measures of tracking translation, you see examples out there where people are gravitating again to a lot of numbers that might not tell us the full story in terms of the contribution of the work that we do. So I think we need to be thinking through these processes, and we need thinking beyond institutions, because there's peer pressure. Institutions would wish to shift, but others are not shifting, and others are rewarded for not shifting, because, for example, if they don't shift, then they might be more favorable when they are ranked by some of the university ranking institutions out there. And so you will have your institution that is reforming, perhaps not seen as favorably as one that's not reforming. So I think there is a need for a broader engagement beyond individual institutions, bringing this conversation to the national and regional levels, and considering a coalition of reforms, both to the external as well as the internal environment within these institutions.
No, I agree with you. There's a lot of discourse that needs to be done. But then it comes down to the very uncomfortable topic, and that is how can universities and research institutions better incentivize and support researchers in translating their findings into products, services, or policies that drive positive impact. So what if you look at a university, we know what they are doing. They are relying on the traditional, I like calling them the traditional ways of incentivization, which means you publish in particular journals, you need to have a certain high impact factor, and which are a bit restrictive. Today, they are a bit restrictive. So now, when we're looking at the open science landscape, what would you tell a university to look at in order to better incentivize and support their researchers, especially if they are already adopting these open science practices, of which they are really with the open access publishing? They're already using one of the pillars through publishing. So how do we talk to a vice chancellor and tell them this is a better way to incentivize your researchers? Look at these other options beyond just the traditional ones. So what would you recommend, or what would you propose as what would potentially work for them?
Yeah, good. I think I would shift this conversation beyond just measurements and incentives to thinking through a broader vision, a broader supportive ecosystem for open science,
right?
Because it goes beyond measurements and rewards to thinking infrastructure, thinking systems, thinking the culture.
Right. Yeah.
Because some of these things have been normalized, they have become the right thing to do, they have become the measure of quality, and they have become the culture. And if you want to shift from this, you're actually viewed as watering down the quality of the work that the institution is doing. You are actually seen like somebody who is spoiling the science.
Yes.
Because
they
have been normalized and they are viewed as a measure of quality and high performance of an institution. So I think this conversation needs to be thought through in a broad, pronged approach, a systems approach and thinking in terms of engagement so before I even go to what they should do specific to incentives, I would talk to them about engaging the key actors within the institution so that we begin to reconceptualize the value of research. What is it, and are we actually achieving it? And if not, what is it that needs to shift? And that making a shift to whether it's opening up, and get moving open science or moving to a different form of measurement should not necessarily water down the quality. In fact, it should increase the quality. Absolutely. Because then the science is more open to scrutiny and we all know what you're doing. Yes. And you can share the tools and you can share your analytic codes. If somebody else wants to relook at what you've done, then they are able to even see whether they can replicate what you did. But at the same time, I think that it's a process that would make data more available to people, even within the same institution, so that data and other tools, so that we can maximize the benefits from this data. We go investing a lot in data when we have a lot of data on the same issues, even within the same institution, but nobody knows who has what data. And then they go and collect the same. In an institution like mine in Makerere, where we have thousands of staff, it's very difficult to know who has done what and which data exists or is available. So there's lots of benefits I would also wish to bring to them. But at the same time, they will say, so what system or infrastructure do I need to actually be able to open up some of these spaces? How do I make the shifts? What are options available to me if I want to change measurements, if I want to incentivize what exists out there? So I think they would also then need to look at some of the tools available there. Like, for example, DORA has quite a number of tools that are now available that institutions can adapt and utilize to have their own context-specific interventions, but using some of the available guidance to be able to do this. So this is something that I would probably think through. How do I go about it? It's a complex shift. How do I move?
Right.
What tools are available for me to use? But at the same time, I would engage to see that the universities need to speak to the external environment and how institutions are perceived. They can also advocate for change, because in some countries, you find that universities are rewarded based on scientific outputs. And so if my budget is going to go down because I am shifting emphasis from certain things, that's a challenge. So you might want to, engage with the sectors, the education and science sectors. Of course, the more complex challenges for universities would be the university rankings and what they are using now.
Oh, yes, they need that. They really rely on those. Yeah.
Yeah, they are also making reforms. So they are moving away from just only publications to also beginning to look at citations and other things, but of course with the limitations that come with some of those. But I know that some of these, like the term higher education, has now integrated knowledge transfer and some of the processes of knowledge transfer. So you can see that they are also beginning to make some reforms that are moving towards impact for research, quality and impact for research. But certainly they drive the behavior of the universities. And that's something that you'd want to also engage with that vice chancellor to know what am I up against, what should I expect, and how will I respond to it if it happens. So it has to be a fairly comprehensive discussion and thinking through. But ultimately, they would need to have policies, strategies, and tools to support the implementation. They would need to have their own institutional measurements derived based on some of the guidance that might exist out there. But ultimately, they have to come up with their own that is customized to their context, depending on what the key stakeholders within that university might want. Yeah.
So, you've been talking about different types of metrics and indicators that we need to look at. You even highlighted the issue on citations, yes, which also has its limitations. So what metrics or indicators would be most effective in measuring the success of these knowledge translation efforts? And how can they be standardized across different fields of research? So what do you think is missing out in terms of the metrics that should be potentially added as a form of measuring assessment?
I think what is missing out is process. Some of these things take a lot of investment in time and money, as I noted earlier, before you realize them. But if you're just going to measure my output on only a paper, or a grant that I got, without looking at what it did and what difference it made, it's a challenge. So we need to be looking at this process. If I'm going to have a knowledge transfer, I'll need partnerships. So if somebody, for example, was able to look at the process, they look at the process of engagement, they look at the partnerships, whether I've partnered with a sector out there like health or education, whether I've partnered with a private sector, and recognized and acknowledged as an important part of the process. And then there are quality issues along the way. So I think that is really important. And I think that is missing. There is a growing example of lists of suggested indicators for measurements of knowledge transfer right from the resources. So I think it's important that we look at the qualitative as well. And I think the qualitative is what is missing, that you can't be able to describe exactly the contribution you have made. If I have done analysis of data, how has that analysis led to change? It's very difficult to do that. If I could use an example of work that we have been doing here in my school, most recently, and for example, so we analyzed data, and we did this as Makerere University in partnership with FHI 360, working on equity, looking at equity in family planning, who is being left behind and what is the problem. And so we picked up quite a number of groups that are being left behind, the younger people, presumably not sexually active, but they are, especially the much younger ones. And then we are looking at some populations. Typically, we used to think rural is disadvantaged, but we are thinking, okay, the peri-urban poor are becoming a very disadvantaged population. So, but long story short, we came up with quite a number of groups that we thought needed more attention, and we engaged a lot. We worked directly with the Ministry of Health in this, including the technical working group. So for the first time, they were able to say, we are going to include equity as a goal in our constant implementation plan for family planning. And out of that, we've been able to then move forward and say, you've included equity, but how exactly is it going to be done? And so we've moved that to having a Uganda-specific definition of what equity means. We moved forward to how will Uganda measure equity. We've moved forward to developing a roadmap towards how Uganda is going to do this and eventually evaluate the impact of that shift in policy. So, and it's taken a lot of work, a lot of meetings, a lot of stuff. But when I look back, like, how do it won't count to my promotion, Joy?
No, that is true. But then there is quite a bit that you are involved in.
So you see, it's for me, even before the papers are published, and by the way, the papers came much later because we were focusing on that process. The papers delayed. So it might appear like my productivity is low, but my impact is huge in that sense.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
And so how do you track that? And how do you, so those are the process things, Joy, that I think are very important. And that's where the qualitative would then help me to say, look, this national plan that has been developed or adjusted because of what I did, there is a whole new structure that has been set up to address the issues that we found. And maybe a few years down the road, we could say, actually, it has then led to certain groups that were being left behind now being addressed, better in terms of service delivery. That is huge impact, but nobody tracks it. I might forget it after a few years, and I will not be rewarded for it. So those are the bits that are missing that I think we need to work on in a very intentional way. And, and actually, Joy, because of that, earlier this year, I was engaging with my colleagues in my school and saying we are going to develop a tool to track the value of our research. So we've now presented it, we are discussing it, and we are continuing to engage with it. And we thought, let's start writing this down because we are cheating ourselves. We don't get enough credit for what we do because we are not even tracking it. So we are now beginning to document, and we are going to see if we can step a few years back and ask people for each of their research projects they've worked on. What difference did it make? Did it lead to a new curriculum, improved teaching for students? Did it lead to a change in how programs are delivered services? Did it lead to a change in policy or a component of a policy? So that people can, and if so, which one, what changed? So that we can begin to document those things. So I believe those are the things that are missing quite often, because that is again different from when I manufacture a vaccine and then I know, I have a patent, it has now been commercial, and I'm even getting money. So often when it comes to the innovation value chain up to commercialization, that becomes so much easier to track. But when it comes to shifts in policy and programs and impacts on the community, sometimes it's very difficult. And I think we need new tools to be able to look at that.
So in essence, what you're saying is that in the process of assessment, institutions need to look beyond the quantitative aspect. They need to look at the qualitative aspect. And that, because there's so much that is done within the qualitative aspect, and the quantitative aspect tends to come in much later in terms of publications and citations. And that's not enough to measure the impact and the involvement of the researcher within the institute. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that leads me to the next question. What can Africa learn from the agreement on reforming research assessment set by the European Union and the Coalition of Advanced Research Assessment, COARA? Because we're looking at all these aspects. Yes.
Yeah, these aspects are actually really emphasized in that coalition, in that agreement. I think that is really, really important for us, because you see that they are reorienting research and taking it back to quality and impact of the research. And these are the very things we've been talking about that are missing. But also because they are doing this as a coalition, they are actually addressing, again, the complexities that I raised earlier. Because they are working in a group, they are advocating for change. And this change is not just internal for one or two institutions, it's a multitude of institutions that will sign off to be part of this. So it gives them the power to shift the ecosystem, and both externally, and to advocate for change for other stakeholders and actors in this broader ecosystem, because it goes much bigger than the institution level environment when we are dealing with science and innovation. So I think there's a lot we can learn, and perhaps we can also begin to say how strong are our own coalitions and networks within Africa.
Right.
And how can we come up with an Africa-specific and responsive mechanism to capture this, and to even also capture our indigenous knowledge, because we've also talked a lot about indigenous knowledge and decolonization of knowledge, some of which have not gone as far as they ought to. So this would also be the opportunity for us to look at the types of knowledge that exist within the African context and how this can be harnessed and also tracked and recognized. So I think it would be a lot of lessons we can pick from this agreement, Quora, but also a lot of lessons that we can pick from DORA. And then at the same time, we can also come up with our own context-specific thinking.
Absolutely.
That needs to work for Africa. Yeah.
So now you just mentioned DORA, and it is actually the next question. And even though you've highlighted the various ways in which you need to improve our assessments and provide better incentives within the institutions, I'd like to know the initiatives like what the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, aim to do is reform the flawed assessment systems. So how specifically do you see DORA help shift shift incentives towards translating research into meaningful policies, programs, and societal benefits, especially within the African context and its complexities?
I think there is a lot of opportunities for us to learn from the work that DORA has done over more than a decade. DORA has really been committed in terms of supporting development of new policies and practice for responsible research assessment. And DORA has developed several criteria and standards that institutions can use as alternatives when they are doing assessments for hiring of new staff, reviewing staff for promotions and the tenure appointments within academic institutions. And these are actually available on the DORA website. So these would actually be very useful. The reformscape is actually a collection of some of these criteria and standards, and one can access them and be able to make adaptations, because the work that DORA has done and also packaged recognizes that institutions have their uniquenesses, and it doesn't mean that they have to use as they are, but that they can also do adaptations. And in fact, because of that, they also propose mechanisms in terms of how institutions can go about evaluating their ecosystem, engaging multiple stakeholders, and making sure that they can advance this. There are several of these, like the space rubric that is available on the website of DORA, that gives institutions some guidance on how they can go around ensuring that these reforms are done. And most recently, DORA has actually sent out a document on responsible use of quantitative indicators. It came out maybe about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's a very fresh document, but it's an analysis of the pros and cons of the commonly used metrics in measurement. So you will find a lot of these that we've been talking about discussed in this, the general impact factors, when and how can they be used, and how does it work across disciplines. They talk about the citations, the H index, and also looking at other metrics like the field normalization citation index, the R metrics. So this document, and it's very easy to read, but it gives the reader, individuals and institutions an opportunity to objectively then decide which of these indicators can I use, or combination of them. And it also does emphasize the value of qualitative narratives, CVs, as an emerging area that could help supplement this. So it's an interesting document, and this can be accessed. And DORA has quite a number of institutions in thousands that have subscribed also, that are signatories. Unfortunately, Africa is among the least represented, because when I look at the recent data from the analysis of the signatories, we see more than 1,100 signatories from South America, 36% of all the signatories. Europe has more than 1,000 as well, at 33%, and North America closing in on 20%. But Africa has only 55 signatories, and representing just 1.7% of the signatories across, and these are coming from just a handful of countries, only 4 countries.
Why is that?
I think it's a combination of issues. It might be an awareness issue, and maybe we need to do more outreach so that they know that these declarations exist, and that they don't just exist for you to sign off, but they also have tools and documents that they have developed that are freely available and can be used. Because when some of the universities are grappling with how to do the reforms, they might not even know where to look for some of these tools. So perhaps we need to do a bit more outreach and get these universities to appreciate that some tools exist. But also partly because the conversations around this need to shift have not been as widespread, and perhaps we need to have these conversations more about reorienting research to quality and impact, and that will go along with improving the measurements and having responsible use of some of the measurements that we have. So I think we need more conversations around this.
And also, I feel that most African universities are still reliant on the traditional methods of assessment and competitiveness, especially when it comes to looking at rankings as well. So
absolutely,
it's a discussion I see with a lot of vice chancellors, where you see them still, unfortunately, holding on to that era, the era where things worked for them without considering the fact that there's a cultural shift in academia, and there's a need to have better assessment, adopt different practices like open science. So there's also that. I think this is going to be a bit of a generational change when you see a new cadre or generation of vice chancellors coming into play. But most importantly, as you said, yes, there's a need for increased awareness on this. I have really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Wanyenze. This has been very enlightening. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wind up?
Not exactly. I've also enjoyed discussing this with you, Joy. I think it's such an important subject because we invest a lot of money in research, and we need results from this investment.
Yeah.
And so part of the reason why some people don't like to fund academic institutions is because they keep asking, what's the value of funding you? But it's because they don't see the value of the research and the work that we do. So I think this would be a great opportunity for us to begin to show off what we can do, so that perhaps we can attract more support. And I think we need to be looking at it from that angle as well as we continue to engage. So I'm looking forward to continuing to speak about this, and hopefully leading to that slow but sure cultural shift.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, goodbye for now.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Mazam Gumzo podcast. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on all our channels for more updates and for candid stories by researchers, policymakers, higher education leaders, and innovators on their journeys. See you in our next episode.